June 5th, 2026, Donald Trump walked out in front of the press corps and said something very specific. He said Iran is now down to approximately 22% of the missiles they had before this war began. He said America has, quote, completed most of the job. He said Iran will be forced to accept things they never thought they would accept because they have no other choice. Now, I want you to hold those numbers in your head because I've seen numbers like these before in a different place at a different time with different people who are absolutely convinced that as long as the numbers looked right, the war was going well. In 1967 in Washington, the 600th Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara walked before Congress and presented a set of figures. The ratio of Viet Cong casualties to American casualties was favorable. The number of villages being pacified was increasing. The amount of weapons being captured was going up. According to every single data point on his charts, the United States was winning overwhelmingly. The resistance from North Vietnam would collapse within months. 8 years later, American helicopters were evacuating off the roof of the embassies in Saigon. Okay, so what I want to do today, and I want to be very clear about what we're doing here, is I want to spend the next 20 minutes showing you precisely why what is happening in Iran in 2/6 is a terrifying mirror image of that same mistake. Not because I have any love for the Iranian government, not because I think America deserves to lose, but because if we cannot see the real picture, we will be completely blindsided by what is coming next. And what is coming next? I'm going to tell you this up front is not really about Iran at all. It's about Taiwan, right? Let's get into it. So the first thing I want to establish is something I call the McNamara fallacy. And this is the conceptual lens we're going to use for everything else today. So I need you to really understand this before we go further. The McNamara fallacy, sometimes called the quantitative fallacy, is a specific type of strategic error that happens when you make decisions based only on what you can measure and you systematically ignore everything that cannot be measured. And it follows 4 steps that repeat themselves in history over and over again, like a song nobody ever bothers to learn the words to. Step 1, you only measure what is easy to measure. Step 2, you discard what is difficult to measure. Step 3, you conclude that what cannot be measured is therefore unimportant. Step 4, you conclude that what cannot be measured therefore does not exist. Okay, McNamara applied this logic to Vietnam by using body count as the metric for victory. And his reasoning was actually very clean and logical on the surface. If we are killing more Viet Cong than North Vietnam can recruit, then mathematically they will run out of people. And when they run out of people, they will lose. Simple arithmetic. What could McNamara not measure? Will, nationalism, the willingness to sacrifice. The belief, the absolute ironclad belief held by the North Vietnamese people that this was a fight for survival, for dignity, for existence itself, and that there could be no retreat. When an advisor suggested putting what he called the X factor into the model, the emotional and psychological state of the South Vietnamese peasantry, McNamara crossed it off the list. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, if it cannot be quantified, it is not operationally significant. So, because he could not put human will into a spreadsheet, he concluded it didn't matter. Now, I want you to look at what America is measuring on June 5th, 2026. They are measuring the number of UAVs shot down. They're measuring the number of ships diverted. They're measuring the percentage of Iranian missiles destroyed. They're measuring the daily economic damage to the Iranian economy. And Donald Trump is standing in front of cameras with those numbers and confidently declaring that Iran has no options left. What is America not measuring? America is not measuring the political will of the Iranian government. America is not measuring the degree to which the war itself is consolidating domestic unity inside Iran. America is not measuring the strategic lessons that Thran has been quietly implementing from history. And this is the most dangerous thing of all. America is not measuring the rate at which its own strategic missile stockpiles are being depleted at an alarming speed. None of those things appear in the daily CENTCOM briefing reports. So, according to McNamara logic, they don't matter. According to McNamara logic, they don't even exist. All right, now I want to add a dimension to this picture that I have not seen any major analysis outlet actually addressing at the level it deserves. Iran is consciously, deliberately, and very systematically applying the political stabilization strategy of North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. I know that sounds like a bold claim. So let me show you exactly how this is playing out, point by point. The first lesson Iran is borrowing from Hanoi is what the Vietnamese called fight and talk. In the period from 1968 to 1972, North Vietnam never stopped fighting while it was negotiating at the Paris peace talks. They sat at that table not because they wanted peace. They sat at that table to buy time to generate political pressure on the American home front to project an image of willingness while never actually conceding anything of substance. Look at Iran on June 5th, 2026. Mohsen Ray, the senior military advisor to the supreme leader, declares that negotiations are at a dead end and that the ball is in Trump's court. Iran then announces that any deal must include the immediate release of $24 billion in frozen assets. And then they tie any ceasefire framework to Israel's complete and unconditional withdrawal from Lebanon, a condition they know Israel will never accept. Okay, think about what that means strategically. These are not the demands of a party that wants to reach an agreement. These are demands carefully engineered to guarantee that no agreement is possible in the near term. Why? Because every day that negotiations fail, Iran gets one more day to reposition its forces, open new supply routes around the blockade, and reinforce its internal political narrative. The table is not a peace table. The table is a clock. The second lesson Iran is borrowing is turning the war itself into a source of internal political strength. Hanoi understood that American bombing campaigns did not break the will of the North Vietnamese people. Every bomb that fell on Hanoi did not shatter the regime. It welded the population together. The Pilot Bureau in Hanoi actually used the pressure of the war to conduct internal purges, arresting officers and intellectuals who favored early negotiation. They called it the anti-party revisionist affair of 1967. The war became the justification for eliminating dissent. The very thing that was supposed to destroy them became the foundation of their survival. Now listen to what Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said this morning, and I want you to pay very careful attention to his exact words. He said, quote, "The war became a source of strength for Iran." He said, "No one expected us to be able to endure and resist for 40 days. He said this was no small matter to force them to seek negotiations and request a ceasefire. He said this with pride, not with desperation, not with the language of a country that is losing. He said this with the confidence of a man who believes his side is winning the war that actually matters, the war of political will." When a foreign minister talks about a conflict that is devastating his country's economy and infrastructure using the language of triumph, you should understand that the McNamara metrics are giving you the wrong movie entirely. The third lesson Iran is borrowing from Vietnam is the asymmetric shield. North Vietnam could not match American firepower in conventional confrontation, so they didn't try. They used guerrilla warfare. They used the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They used hit-and-run attrition. The logic was elegant in its brutality. Forced the most expensive military in human history to spend vastly disproportionate resources destroying things of minimal value. Iran is doing this with 21st century technology. Every single attack drone Iran launches costs a few thousand. Every single Patriot interceptor missile the United States fires to shoot it down cost between $3 and $4 million. Does that ratio make sense to you? It should, because that ratio means that every engagement Iran initiates is a financial win for Tran, regardless of whether the drone actually hits anything. The goal is not to destroy American assets. The goal is to force America to burn through its most expensive and hard disks to replace stockpiles defending against cheap expendable hardware. And today, and this is something almost no one is reporting, Iran just opened a new bypass route around the American naval blockade. The port of Wazir in Iraq is now emerging as a transit hub for Iran-bound cargo. Ships are unloading in UAE ports, transferring goods to vessels flying non-Iranian flags, routing through UNASR, and then moving the cargo into Iran. The Ho Chi Minh Trail of 2026 just grew a new branch. It doesn't appear in any CENTCOM report. There are moments in international politics where the surface narrative feels deceptively simple, yet beneath it lies a far more layered and unstable structure. What appears on daily news cycles to be a sequence of isolated military exchanges, economic pressures, and diplomatic statements is often interpreted by analysts through competing frameworks of power, endurance, and strategy. One such framework draws heavily on historical analogies, especially Vietnam, Cold War proxy systems, and the limitations of quantitative military assessments to argue that modern conflicts cannot be understood purely through metrics like destroyed equipment, intercepted missiles, or short-term battlefield gains. Within this interpretive lens, a key concept is strategic autonomy, the idea that states engaged in asymmetric conflict often seek external support without surrendering decision-making authority to their patrons. Historical examples are frequently invoked, particularly North Vietnam's ability to secure extensive Soviet and Chinese assistance while maintaining an independent strategic direction. The claim is that successful smaller powers do not simply become extensions of larger allies. Rather, they extract resources, intelligence, and diplomatic protection while carefully preserving sovereignty over their own escalation logic. In this framing, a contemporary Iran is sometimes described as attempting a similar balancing act, accepting external assistance from major powers while simultaneously signaling that its decisions are not subordinated to any external capital. From this perspective, even official diplomatic language becomes analytically significant. Statements emphasizing national independence in decision-making are interpreted not merely as a rhetorical positioning, but as deliberate signals directed toward allied powers. The underlying message in this interpretation is that cooperation should not be mistaken for control, and that assistance does not equate to command authority. This distinction becomes central to the broader argument that in modern proxy-adjacent conflicts, the decisive factor is not only military capability, but also the degree to which local actors can avoid becoming structurally dependent on their supporters. A second layer of the argument involves what is sometimes described as steel manning the opposing position. In this case, the proposition that the United States is achieving its strategic objectives through sustained pressure. This view emphasizes measurable indicators: economic strain, currency depreciation, degradation of military infrastructure, and the cumulative impact of prolonged engagement. In such an assessment, the transfer of sensitive materials, concessions in negotiations, or reductions in operational capacity are interpreted as evidence of effective coercive pressure. From this standpoint, the trajectory of the conflict appears to validate the effectiveness of sustained multi-domain pressure, military, economic, and diplomatic, over time. However, critics of this purely quantitative interpretation argue that such metrics can be misleading if detached from behavioral and strategic responses. They point to continued missile launches, ongoing regional escalation patterns, and the absence of decisive diplomatic resolution as indicators that pressure has not translated into strategic capitulation. In this view, the persistence of offensive or retaliatory actions suggests that capability degradation does not necessarily equate to diminished willingness or ability to escalate. The contradiction between material strain and operational behavior becomes one of the central analytical tensions. To explain this tension, some analysts introduce the role of external great powers as force multipliers. In this interpretation, conflicts are not confined to bilateral dynamics, but are shaped by layered networks of support, intelligence sharing, technology transfer, and diplomatic shielding. Historical parallels are again drawn to the Cold War, when competing blocs provided client states with equipment, logistics, and political backing that allowed them to sustain prolonged conflict beyond what their domestic capacity alone would permit. The modern version of this argument suggests that technological integration, satellite intelligence, financial systems, and defense hardware create interconnected ecosystems rather than isolated battlefields. Within this framework, technological diffusion becomes a central concern. Advanced systems developed in one strategic environment can be adapted, studied, or indirectly leveraged in another. The claim is not necessarily direct operational coordination, but rather a cascading flow of capability. Research, reverse engineering, adaptation, and eventual deployment in third or party theaters. This produces what some describe as feedback learning loops, where real-world conflicts become testing environments for doctrines, sensors, and countermeasures that may later be applied elsewhere. Closely tied to this is the economic dimension of modern warfare. High-cost interception systems deployed against low-cost drones or missiles introduce asymmetries in expenditure rates, raising concerns about long-term sustainability. The argument here is not simply about battlefield outcomes, but about strategic depletion, whether sustained defensive operations can erode stockpiles faster than they can be replenished. From this perspective, the critical variable is not immediate success in intercepting threats, but the cumulative cost of maintaining that defensive posture over time. This leads into a broader strategic claim often made in such analyses, that contemporary conflicts may be interconnected rather than isolated. Pressure applied in one theater can indirectly affect readiness in another, particularly when advanced munitions and air defense systems are finite and logistically complex to replace. Under this logic, regional conflicts are not discrete events, but a part of a larger global equilibrium in which resources, attention, and industrial capacity are continuously redistributed. At the same time, there is a competing critique of this entire framework, rooted in skepticism of overinterpretation. This counterargument emphasizes that correlation is not causation, that information in modern conflicts is fragmented and often unreliable, and that intelligence assessments from opposing sides frequently diverge significantly.